All right, good morning and welcome to the Drop Site News Tuesday morning live stream. So voters go to the polls in Honduras on Sunday. Now, last week, we were joined on the stream by José Luis Granados Ceja, Mexican reporter, and to discuss the Mexico City protests. By popular demand, he is back this week. He's going to be traveling to Honduras to talk about to cover those elections. He's going to talk about the U.S. attempts to interfere there, as well as everything else that's going on, why they matter. Afterwards, we're going to be joined by my colleague Jeremy Scahill, who will talk about this story he published on Sunday. If you haven't read that yet, very very much worth a read. Talking to an array of figures from the spectrum of the Palestinian resistance, including figures from top figures from Hamas, Islamic Jihad, on how they are currently viewing the situation in Gaza, including the recent UN Security Council resolution to rubber stamp Trump's quote unquote board of peace. After that, we're going to talk about the effort to free American teenager Mohammed Ibrahim. We're going to be joined by Jasper Nathaniel, and importantly, also by his mother, who he has talked about has been relentlessly lobbying her members of Congress in New York and her senators. We'll share a video that his sister surreptitiously took of her calling Kirsten Gillibrand, rather moving act of solidarity, and all the more moving for the difficulty that it entails, because she is really pushing against an absolute brick wall. But there is no justification for American representatives refusing to even speak up on behalf of a teenager who is being held and tortured by a foreign country. So that'll be in the back half. That'll be the back end of the show. Joining us now, though, is José Luis. José Luis, how are you?
Very good. Thank you so much for inviting me back here. What a great lineup you have today on today's show.
It's going to be. And so you're heading tomorrow to Honduras. So sketch out for us the background here. So I think maybe we can start in 2009. The current president's, Xiomara Castro's current president's husband is in office at the time and is ousted in a coup. The level of U.S. involvement has been debated, but the U.S. support for that coup is not in dispute. And the U.S. immediately afterwards, once the right wing took over, recognized that government and helped keep in place conditions that kept the narco-trafficking right-wing government in place for the next couple of terms. But then Castro comes storming back. She seems to be almost as popular at this point as Claudia Sheinbaum. So walk us through what made Castro such a popular figure and what makes this a difficult re-election for the left.
Sure. I think 2009 is a great place to start, precisely because I think everything that has played out over the last few years is a response to that moment. And you're right, the U.S. involvement was important. I think, even Hillary Clinton wrote about it in her memoirs about her involvement in that. And it was a different moment in Latin America. There was a lot of pushback there. And in fact, even the OAS actually played a relatively positive role in actually denouncing that coup. But that coup was consolidated. Ultimately, Mel Zelaya was ousted from power. The left forces that he represented were marginalized, and they were marginalized through a brutal dictatorship, through a lot of violence, through the repression of activists and organizers against labor unions and the rest of it. And I think, to fast forward a little bit, we end up having a two-term leadership of a gentleman named Juan Orlando Hernandez. And Juan Orlando Hernandez comes from the National Party, and he presided over a brutally violent dictatorship, winning under disputed conditions there, very much with the support of the United States. But interestingly enough, he was widely believed, and it was eventually proven in U.S. courts, to be directly tied to narco trafficking. But of course, that wasn't an issue for the United States because, as that saying goes in foreign policy circles in Washington, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And so as long as he was doing what the United States was seeking to do in Central America, its priorities there with that region, then they were happy to tolerate his very clear connections until ultimately he left office. Now, In the 2021 elections, we saw the end of the National Party rule, which installed itself after the coup against Mel Zelaya, with the victory of Xiomara Castro in those elections. And it was a very interesting moment. I happened to be in Honduras for those elections as well. And it was really obvious the moment I arrived in the country that the mood in the country was for change, that they wanted to see an ouster of the traditional parties in Honduras. Usually would trade back and forth between the Liberal Party and the National Party. The National Party is probably the most sort of prolific political organization. They have very deep roots in the country, a lot of kind of grassroots structures that allowed them to be able to stay in power for many years. And there was this, breaking up of this previous kind of arrangement in Honduras with the election of Libre. Libre, Libertad y Refundación, is a product of the resistance on the streets in communities against this coup. It is the political party that emerged as a result of the National Front of Resistance. And she presided over a left-wing government that I think actually did achieve a lot of important things, which explains her popularity around reducing poverty. Central American countries experience extreme levels of poverty, and she was able to reduce by 13% the levels of poverty in her country. Investments in infrastructure, building hospitals and roads, but I think the important thing here, and probably why we're also seeing a lot of U.S. attention, is for geopolitical reasons. So Xiomara Castro Libre is very much aligned with the left-wing governments of the region. So Mexico is a very strong ally. In fact, Xiomara Castro was just here in Mexico for a bilateral meeting with Claudia Sheinbaum, but also with Venezuela, with Nicaragua, with Cuba, but also some of sort of the central-left governments as well. It's very much viewed as kind of part of that grouping of progressive countries. And also I think it's important to mention is that her government presided over a pivot away from Taiwan to China, and officially recognizing the People's Republic of China and signing cooperation agreements with China there. And so that's why we're seeing a renewed interest in this. And of course, also responds to the fact that we're also in a moment where the United States is very much interested in digging its claws back into the region. And I think that's also why we're seeing this. And in a lot of ways, what happens in the elections, I think, will be a test in terms of how far can the U.S. actually influence things in order to get governments that are friendly. And this upcoming election is very much, it looks to be breaking down between that. So Xiomara Castro can't run for re-election. She's prohibited by the Constitution for seeking re-election. And the candidate for Libre is Rixi Moncada, who represents, I think, sort of the more progressive, the more left-wing aspect of the Libre party. And her main rival is Salvador Nasralla, who's running on behalf of the Liberal Party. And he's the one who's really kind of been trying to drum up as much support as possible, above all from the Florida lobby, or as I call it, the Gusano lobby, which is incredibly powerful and has been very active.
The Rubio lobby. Yeah,
that's right.
So what it reminds, so what we're seeing in the news now are all of these warnings, vague warnings that, look out, election fraud is going to take place. The incumbent government is going to steal the election. Be scared. And it reminds me of, I believe it was 2019 Bolivian election, where the right there for weeks leading into the election claimed that there was going to be election fraud. Then the vote happened. Morales was clearly winning, and they cried foul, and they got other kind of stamps of approval from various kind of allies of the U.S. to say, yes, this does look fraudulent. They pour out into the streets, and they basically overthrow the government. And that coup government lasted only 1 year because it was so unpopular. It did end up leading kind of to the breakup of the left parties over there, and now the right has taken over in Bolivia. But are we seeing that again? Is that what the Honduran right is trying to set the stage for by talking about all of the potential voter fraud going? And what U.S. role do we see here? Because you're hearing a lot of the Libre Party folks say the U.S. is meddling in this. Like, so how?
So you're absolutely right to compare it to Bolivia. In fact, the right tried to do the same thing here in Mexico. And it's really kind of an unfortunate feature of Latin American politics, especially when the leading contenders involve somebody who's left of center, which is that you can't just win by a small margin. You have to win by a really large margin for two reasons. One, to kind of overcome—
too big to rig, as Trump calls it.
Basically, yeah. Oddly enough, he's right on that. In terms of accounting for the irregular activities that do happen in every election that are not usually enough to change the result, but can be, and historically there we have had instances of that, but also to calm the waters, to basically remove all of that doubt. And this election is very tight. It's not like the 2021 election where the winner was overwhelming and it was obvious to everybody, and even if they wanted to cry fraud, no one would believe them. This is going to be a tight race. The polls are very difficult to trust. They're kind of all over the map. I was reviewing them this morning, and they kind of paint a picture of a country divided in three between Libre, Liberals, and National Party supporters. But really, it's between Libre and the Liberal Party in Salvador Nasrallah versus Rixi Moncada. The National Party obviously does have a lot of strength and will likely have a strong presence in the Congress, but when it comes to the presidential election, it's largely between those two, and it's going to be close. And because it's close, if it's not, say, 5% difference between the first and second place, and of course Honduras only has one round, so they don't necessarily have to secure 50%. It's first past the post. Whoever gets the most votes in this election will become the president. Well, they're going to dispute it, and that's why you're hearing all of this noise now. They're sowing the seeds. They're trying to lay the groundwork for disputing it, even if it's clear that Rixi won, that it's going to be a lot of instability if the victory isn't enough. And so this noise that we're hearing from people like Maria Elvira Salazar and, this hearing that she had from Salvador Nasrallah himself, who recently reposted, oddly enough, a video of Venezuelan far-right activist Maria Corina Machado on his social media accounts, to send this idea that it's going to be an election that's under dispute. And on the one hand, try to overturn it, as we saw in Bolivia, to try to create so much instability on the ground that there's no choice but to find another exit to the crisis, or to undermine the government before they even get into office, to kind of weaken them so that they will have a lot of difficulty governing, which is actually a little bit of what we saw in the case of the current president, Xiomara Castro, where we saw her actually really struggling to get any legislation through and the rest of it because of the difficult conditions for governability there. It's setting up to be a quite difficult circumstance. But I think there is where it's important for the international community. That's why I'll be traveling there with a number of other observers. There's thousands of accredited observers who are going to be on the ground reporting on this, to be able to denounce any irregular activities, if there is some, to alert if these irregular activities rise to the level of actually undermining the integrity of the vote. And if there aren't presented, if we can say that the results represent the will of the Honduran people, to be able to defend that, because there's going to be a very determined effort to undermine Rixi Moncada's government if she ends up being the winner.
Is the left in Honduras galvanized and organized enough to defend a victory? If it is a narrow victory, or is it, because sometimes you get a situation where there's a dispirited sense among the cadres and they just kind of go home.
So certainly
in the face of repression.
The Liberal Party would activate its bases, and it does have considerable support amongst the population. I mean, this was a left-wing government that did deliver results to the population in some regards, but there is tensions between sort of the social movements. For example, many of your viewers and listeners may be familiar with the Garifuna communities on the northern coast of Honduras, which are very autonomous, very well organized. They've obviously had a lot of differences concerning around the lack of progress that the government has been able to do around key issues, like these attempts to build these private cities, for example, the encroachments on their territory.
Like
so there are some tensions there.
Cities. Yeah.
But I do think that if there is a circumstance where we're seeing blatant, direct U.S. interference attempts on Honduran sovereignty, that the social movements also have the clarity that there are things that go beyond their particular differences in a given moment with the government of the day, to defend their institutions, to defend their country. Because I think most people, certainly in Latin America, and I think Honduras is one of the countries where there is probably a heightened understanding of this, is that you don't want to invite the United States in right now. And I think it's really worth reminding people that the United States interference in other countries has been disastrous for many people throughout this region. We're seeing this bombing campaign. We saw this effort to blatantly interfere in the Argentine elections. We saw what happened in Ecuador, although obviously the population there said no to the plans for U.S. bases there. So speaking of U.S. bases, the United States does have an active presence inside of Honduras. This stems from the 80s, from the Cold War era. So, Hondurans are very aware what it would mean for a U.S.-friendly government to come in, especially if they come in, by trying to sow chaos on the streets. And so it'll be really important to see not just what happens on Sunday in the actual vote, but everything following. What will be the mood on the streets in terms of responding to what the actual results are.
And last question for you. What I'm trying to figure out is, what is really driving the U.S. policy here? Because, okay, you can imagine 100 years ago or so, U.S. is a little bit smaller. The world is smaller to the United States. Gunboat diplomacy and basically imperial control of Central and South America was important to U.S. policy, U.S. identity. It's 2025. Like, why are we bothering with Honduras? Like, no offense to Honduras, but the United States GDP is not going to move much one way or the other, whether or not we allow union organizing and environmental protection and allow for some economic growth and dignity in Honduras. The thinking was 100 years ago, you can't allow for any of that. You got to keep everybody miserable. On the other hand, if we do succeed in installing a right-wing government that makes the conditions of life untenable for people in Honduras, we'll then see a lot more pressure from Hondurans on the southern border, which actually the American right does care about. Like, that's something they don't want. So then you have the Florida lobby, the Gusano lobby, the Rubio types who just have this grudge over decades. I guess I understand emotionally where that comes from. But so from your understanding, like, what is the U.S. doing? Like, why does it even care so much as to be a player in Sunday's Honduran elections?
It's really quite interesting because a lot of their policies ultimately are counterproductive to their own stated policy goals.
Yeah.
It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, for example, to be attacking Venezuela. And, there's still all these rumors going on about whether there's going to be land strikes. I mean, that's obviously going to produce another new wave of migration. And so, even in the case of Honduras, for a long time, it's no longer the case today, but they were the number one countries of migration because of the brutal government of Juan Orlando Hernandez, which basically was expelling people. And in fact, one of the challenges of this current government, Xiomara Castro, has been all of the people being deported back to Honduras, who many of whom have no roots with the country anymore, or don't have the networks. And so trying to kind of reintegrate them back into society. Some of them don't even speak Spanish. They've lived so many years in the United States. So it's been a real challenge. It's an influx of people that you have to find jobs for, right? And their social safety net isn't as deep or wide as it is in other countries because of its relatively lesser affluence as a result of its economy. So what is actually driving this? Like you said, I think frankly the Gusano lobby plays a really big role. And sometimes in some ways I'm grateful because they often say the quiet part out loud.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard Trump talking about going after the oil in Venezuela. We heard Maria Revilla Salazar say the same exact thing about Venezuela, or oil companies are there, and she happens to be the same person also really kind of pushing on this. And so I do think a lot of it is sort of imperial ambitions. And I think I mentioned on the previous program here that, there seems to be an acknowledgement, even from Marco Rubio, that the battle for global hegemony has been lost. They now have a pure rival in China. And so they feel that the way to reassert their authority, the way that they'll be able to, in a future moment, dispute global hegemony again, because that is their intention, is just a strategic retreat to their traditional spheres of influence in order to build up the capacity to dispute. And so in Honduras, in some ways, is also a bit of, like I said at the beginning, a test case. Can we interfere? Can we actually, meddle to the degree that we actually have an influence on the result in order to have more favorable governments there so they can keep doing it? They basically, so it's a test to do it in the future. For example, I've always thought in the case of Venezuela, the whole Guaidó experiment of recognizing somebody who had no real claim to the presidency as president, if that had succeeded, that would have been the strategy of U.S. imperialism in the region moving forward, to simply not recognize governments. And again, I think, some of what we're seeing right now, with the sowing of all of this doubt and uncertainty about what the result will actually represent, is to say that, well, we don't consider it a legitimate government. And then you'll probably see some of the same accusations we're seeing now in the case of Maduro and Gustavo Petro in Colombia, which is trying to suggest that they're narco traffickers and that therefore they can be treated as criminals and not as legitimate political actors. That makes it a whole lot easier for them to drive their policy goals forward. And so I think a lot of this is just about seeing how far they can get to do it in the future, to do it in much bigger places like Brazil, places like Mexico, which obviously have much larger economies and much closer relationships with a lot of different actors at the global stage. And, it's easier to try to experiment in a country like Honduras because, it is a smaller country with a smaller population that maybe they feel would be easier to manipulate to kind of test things out in order to drew it down again in the future, because this is the future of Latin America. It's going to be a question of sovereignty. It's going to be a question of, will Latin America have the political forces and organization to resist this onslaught by the United States that they have made very clear is what's coming?
All right, we'll see. And we'll be following this Sunday. Be safe down in Honduras, and we'll look forward to you reporting back, Jose Luis Granados Ceja. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Jeremy, thank you for joining. How are you?
Good morning, Ryan.
Jorge Luis is great. I don't know if you got to catch much of that.
I did.
Really, really tremendous reporter out of Mexico City. He's headed down to Honduras to cover these elections on Sunday. Gonna be interesting because as the world breathes a bit of a sigh of relief that the U.S. is pulling back a little bit on its global hegemony, it's our friends closest to us that are going to be the ones that suffer from kind of this pivot and this retreat back. Honduras being the first test case of that, probably. But so I wanted to talk to you about the piece that you published on Sunday at Drop Site News. Can you talk a little bit about what the mood was among the resistance officials that you interviewed for this piece, and if there was a kind of collective sense of mood, or if there's a kind of pawing or kind of uncertainty at this moment?
And just to give this a little bit of background, the way that that the Palestinian position in these negotiations, with whether it's with the Trump administration or it was under Joe Biden, or now it's dealing with this UN Security Council endorsement of Trump's plan for a privatized force to come in and occupy Gaza indefinitely and disarm the Palestinian resistance movements, is that there's just been journalistic malpractice in claiming that it's just Hamas that is on the other end of the negotiating table. And I think this is really important for people to understand, because you do not hear this or read this in the broader media discourse, certainly not in the English language. Beginning in July of 2024, a wide range of more than a dozen Palestinian factions and political parties have been regularly meeting. And this effort was spearheaded by Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, who has been on this stream before and is a prominent Palestinian physician. He's a doctor. He's been shot before, but he doesn't control an armed force. He ran for president in the last elections that were allowed in Palestine. He was a member of the parliament, elected to the parliament in 2006. And he's a widely respected figure. And he really was one of the central people in trying to develop a unified Palestinian response to the Israeli genocide, but then also to have a wider cross-section of Palestinians weigh in on what the official response was going to be from Hamas or Islamic Jihad, the two political entities that have armed wings that are fighting against the Israeli occupation and the genocide in Gaza. And so in July, they convened all 14 Palestinian political factions in Beijing, China. And they came up with a unified position that was endorsed by Hamas and Islamic Jihad that envisioned the formation of a national unity government that could step into Gaza so that the groundwork could be laid to prepare for elections. And they also had a wide range of positions on achieving a ceasefire, on the exchange of captives, et cetera. This goes back to July of 2024. They've been meeting consistently. Most recently, they met in late October in Cairo. And I'm bringing this up because what has been put forward by the Trump administration and now has been endorsed in this kind of fabricated stamp of international legitimacy, when the UN Security Council adopted Trump's plan, is a really sweeping agenda that cuts to the heart of whether Palestine is going to achieve self-determination and an independent state. And so when you talk to, I didn't just speak to Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad last week, I also spoke to Dr. Barghouti. I spoke to people from the secular left-wing PFLP. I spoke to people who were dissidents within Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah movement. By the way, Mahmoud Abbas, whose popularity is really, really minuscule and is widely viewed as a collaborator with the Israeli occupation by Palestinians, the most recent public opinion polling indicates that his popularity is extremely low and that Palestinians don't view him as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and that if elections were held tomorrow, Hamas actually would still be the single most popular political party in all of Palestine, not just in Gaza. And the number one most popular political leader in Palestine who would win an election, according to the most recent polls, is, of course, Marwan Barghouti, who came out of the Fatah movement, was a leader of the Second Palestinian Intifada. And some people have, compared him to Nelson Mandela, an imprisoned political prisoner who enjoys widespread popularity. He's been the number one name on the list put forward by Hamas and Islamic Jihad to have exchanged in these exchange of captives deals linked to a ceasefire. So to directly answer your question, it's not just about what Hamas and Islamic Jihad think, because as we've said before, they believed that and in fact, they were given the mandate by these 14 Palestinian political factions to negotiate terms of a ceasefire, exchange of captives, resumption of aid. Everything else, they said, has to be discussed in a democratic process among all Palestinian factions. And they have invited Abbas and Fatah to join these discussions because they really do represent a majority of the Palestinian people. And so their perspective right now is that embedded within Trump's plan are a number of ideas that they already have been on the record of supporting. For instance, they've said, we want an independent technocratic committee comprised of Palestinian experts to step in and administer the Gaza Strip so that we can prepare the groundwork for elections. Trump's plan mentions an independent technocratic committee of Palestinians. But the Palestinian faction said it must actually be in charge, that Palestinians must be in control of their own destiny, their own governance, have the ability to be seen as the negotiators of their own future. Trump's plan says, no, no, no. My board of peace, which is chaired, and Trump talks about himself in the third person, by one Donald J. Trump, is going to be in charge of this Palestinian committee. So essentially, they're just going to relegate them to basic civic duties. But Trump and Tony Blair and others are going to actually be the ones in charge. The Palestinian factions also said, we'll agree to the deployment of an international force. But they said, we want it to be under the auspices of the United Nations. And we want that force not to be an occupying force, but to be akin to a peacekeeping force like those that have been in Lebanon, and to monitor the implementation of the ceasefire, which Israel is systematically violating, killing more than 340 Palestinians since October 10th. So and then there's the big issue, which is disarmament. Trump and Netanyahu are saying that in phase 2 of this Trump plan, the Palestinians must disarm. Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, told a business conference in Miami on November 6th that Hamas officials had told him and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, that they would hand their weapons over and that they were just waiting for an international force to deploy. So I spoke to senior officials, Palestinian officials, who literally were in those meetings, and they said, we have no idea what Witkoff is talking about. We said nothing of the sort. I asked the State Department for comment about that. I reached out to Witkoff. They didn't respond. But Ryan, what I think is important for people to understand is that there is nuance in the position of Hamas and Islamic Jihad on this issue that never gets reported. And so what we did in our piece was to go and speak to Hamas and Islamic Jihad officials and say, what is your actual position on disarmament? And I just want to share something, and then I'll stop and you can follow up with any questions you have about this. But I spoke to Dr. Mohammed al-Hindi. I've interviewed him many times, and actually he never speaks to Western media. This was one of the co-founders of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. That organization was started in the 1980s before the creation of Hamas. The other co-founder of Islamic Jihad, Dr. Fatih Shakaki, was assassinated by Israel in the 1990s in Malta. He was gunned down by assassins riding on a motorcycle after he had gotten back from a trip to Libya. But Dr. Mohammed al-Hindi is the chief political negotiator for Islamic Jihad and was directly involved with the negotiations over Trump's plan. And this is what he said. So remember, what the US and Israel are saying is Hamas refuses to disarm, because what they're defining disarmament as is that all weapons disappear, that Palestinians no longer have a right to defend themselves against this genocidal army that is trying to kill them and has murdered tens of thousands of them and continues to violate the ceasefire. So remember, what Israel and the US say is they're refusing, totally to disarm, and Israel may have to restart the war. Mohammed al-Hindi said, the matter of weapons is not up for discussion, meaning that handing over the weapons is not negotiable. But the appearance of weapons or the use of weapons, this is something that can be discussed, meaning no form of weapon would appear in the Palestinian streets, and the Palestinian police and security forces would have full control over the streets. Training sites for resistant fighters would disappear, the weapons would be stored, and we would enter into a truce with its duration defined. But the idea that we would go out and hand over our weapons, what weapons are even in Gaza to begin with? And then he goes on and he explains to us the domestic manufacturing process of the Palestinian weapons. Musa Abu Marzouk, a senior official from Hamas, has said that they're open to something akin to a decommissioning process. But he said that Trump and Netanyahu have bragged that they've decimated the Qassam brigades, that they've wiped out the rocket capacity, or that the rocket capacity has been depleted in the early stages or the earlier stages of this war. And so what the actual Palestinian position is on this, which doesn't get reported in the press, is that they're saying, we are not going to hand over our weapons to some international force controlled by Trump's Board of Peace, but we're interested in a long-term, internationally monitored and verified truce with Israel, during which our weapons will be stored. They won't appear on the street. We will shut down the training camps, and we will accept the deployment of a Palestinian police force, including under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, even though Mahmoud Abbas is basically just being used now by Trump and others to give some veneer of legitimacy to say, oh, the Palestinians support this. But even Hamas and Islamic Jihad are saying, okay, if they want Mahmoud Abbas, they want the Palestinian Authority, that's fine. If it's a Palestinian police force, we will engage in this. But what they won't do is say, we're going to just surrender our weapons while we're in the midst of a genocide. And if people want there to be no more Hamas or Islamic Jihad as armed groups, then we need the establishment of a Palestinian state with a national armed force capable of defending itself. So you can think what you want about these positions, but let's report on them accurately. So what Jawa Ahmed and I tried to do in these interviews was to say, let's fact check what we're told. Let's actually speak directly to them. And what you're not hearing is, we won't negotiate this issue at all. What you're hearing is, we're a national liberation movement. We aren't going to surrender. They couldn't compel us to do it militarily. We're not going to do it with this Trump-backed plan, but we are reasonable people whose main goal is national liberation. And so there's nuance to it. That's the negotiating position.
Yeah, there was a striking point that Mohammed al-Hindi made that actually dovetailed with something that I just kind of had been intuitively thinking about disarmament. And it goes back to, well, his question, well, what are the arms? The arms that matter, at least for the resistance and for the Israeli military, the rocket propelled grenades, the Yasin, like that's the real danger. That's the real danger to the Israelis. That's the genuine weapon for the resistance. And the material for those comes almost primarily from unexploded Israeli ordnance, which is everywhere in Gaza because they have carpet bombed the area for 2 straight years. And, a significant portion of everything you drop is unexploded. You combine that with the kind of indigenous know-how of how to, manufacture those weapons. The point that he made was, you could take every single weapon. If hostilities resumed, we could reproduce them very quickly, which to me doesn't actually read as a threat. What that reads as is, so let's solve this. I think
that's right.
Right.
Remember too, Hindi was he's a pediatric surgeon. And I've said this before, but it's really interesting. When you talk to these guys about sort of how did they get involved with this, these are very, very well educated people who, he worked for a Christian NGO in Gaza for years. As a pediatric surgeon, and he worked with pregnant women. And he himself grew up his family are descendants of the Nakba. He himself grew up in a very heady time politically, when the Palestinian resistance movement was largely secular, when you had the Iranian Revolution took place, where you had a discourse that was spreading around the Arab and Islamic world about what does it mean, what do terms like self-determination mean, what does it mean to fight for the liberation of Palestine. And they debated all these ideas. They debated Marxist theory. They debated theories of political Islam. And, they started by creating an illegal print press. That's how Islamic Jihad started. And this is someone that has negotiated, has been in and out of Israeli prisons, has been in and out of detention by the Palestinian Authority, has negotiated ceasefire deals. When Islamic Jihad and Israel fought a war that Hamas sat out, it was Mohammed al-Hindi who negotiated the deal. I'm telling you this because these guys understand Israel. They've dealt with them for a long time. They also have a realistic view of their prospects for achieving liberation that I think is rooted in their history. And so when they talk about this issue of the weapons, what they're saying is what you just said, which is, you want us to hand over some weapons. Okay, somebody gives you some rifles. And then what? You come at us again? And for our survival, we manufacture them again. And yes, we have your unexploded ordnance, but we also have a highly educated society because you've locked us in a prison camp. Gaza has some of the highest percentages of higher degrees of any concentrated population in the world. But the other part of it, I mean, and John Elmer from Electronic Intifada, our friends, he's done incredible just documentation of the engineering corps of the Qassam brigades and others. So what he's saying is, this isn't, the world is being hoodwinked right now. This isn't actually about guns. What this is about is attempting to compel the Palestinians to subject themselves to the rule of Israel and Trump's private committee. And we're not going to do that. So if you want this crisis to end, if you actually want peace, Trump talked about the greatest thing in 3,000 years in the Middle East. If you actually want that, then you negotiate with us and you talk with us. And I think that their perspective is, we have a very reasonable perspective on weapons of self-defense, and we're willing to sit at the negotiating table, and we're even willing to allow this puppet regime of Abbas to be the one that you bring in if you think that that's the reasonable solution. But at the end of the day, Palestinians, like everyone else, have a right to democratic elections. And who's going to win those democratic elections is not going to be Mahmoud Abbas.
Let me put the, whoops, that's not it. I'm trying to figure out the system here. Let me put this piece up so folks can see it. It's called Weapons of Willpower, Hamas and Islamic Jihad on Trump's Gaza Plan by Jeremy and Jawa Ahmad. Highly recommend the piece if you haven't seen it yet. I mean, if you haven't read it yet. Jeremy, I don't know what your schedule is today. Up next, we're going to have Jasper Nathaniel. And if she can join, his mom, who has been calling Senator Gillibrand, Representative George Latimer in New York, just relentlessly on behalf
following her, yeah.
American teenager Mohammed Ibrahim. Stick around as long as you can, but I know you've got a busy day you've got to you feel free to roll whenever you can.
I want to say about Nathaniel that right now in the occupied West Bank, there's an unprecedented level of terrorist activity. There's an unprecedented level of terrorist activity being unleashed against the Palestinians, and of course with the full backing of Israeli formal security forces. And the reporting that Jasper has done is so vital, and I would encourage people to hop onto his social media feeds and to watch what he's doing, because the credibility of his reporting is impeccable, and the just the temerity to be there and to bear witness, and then never doubt the ferocity of someone's mom getting involved.
Yep.
So big props to her as well.
Yeah, Infinite Jazz is the Substack, and I think also a lot of his social media feeds, so people should definitely check that out. But Jasper, thanks so much for joining us here.
Thanks, Ryan and Jeremy. Thank you. My mom is just off to the side, like giggling like a child listening to you compliment her and me. So thank you. Here, I'm just gonna bring her in. This is her camera debut. So
hello. Hey, so Jasper's mom, does she know yet that she was surreptitiously recorded?
Yeah, well,
now I know.
Now she knows. My sister was here. Is here. We're at my family house where I grew up for Thanksgiving, and she's got a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old, and my mom was on babysitting duty while making her calls, and so Emma was like, "Well, I'm gonna record her then." And then before I shared it on social, she made sure it was okay.
Oh, fair enough. I
Yeah.
did want to play it for people because I found it to be like a genuinely, moving act of solidarity in the face of just, just an unmovable object. So let me play some of this for the audience in case they haven't seen it yet. But I hope this does go viral and everybody does eventually end up seeing it. Tell me if you can.
Okay, now Gillibrand, and then Latimer. What? Yes.
That's my sister saying, "Are you going to watch your grandkids after this?"
And this is every day she's doing this.
Yeah, she just literally was doing it right before. I was like, "Mom,
Hi, I'm glad to get somebody. My name is,
going on the
and
show."
just for context, I'm a 76-year-old Jewish grandmother, a lifelong New Yorker, and a lifelong Democrat. I have voted for Senator Gillibrand for every election she's been in, including when she was pregnant. So I have two questions. One, which you should have, because I've been calling every single day for a month trying to get an answer, which I think it's kind of difficult for a constituent not to be able to get an answer from her own senator. So the first question is why she didn't sign on to the letter of October 21st from Congress that went out to Marco Rubio and Mike Huckabee asking for the release of the American teenager, Mohammed, Mohammed, Ibrahim, Ibrahim, who's been held incommunicado without any contact with his family since last February when he was abducted by the IDF. This is a child who's in an Israeli torture camp. There's evidence he's been beaten. He's lost a quarter of his body weight. I'd like Senator Gillibrand to imagine if this were her child, what she would want done in a foreign prison. And the second is why she didn't sign on to the November 6th letter that went out to Benjamin Netanyahu, asking him to rescind the demolition orders for this small little village, Keir, and why she sees fit not to comment on any of this when we give billions of dollars to Israel every year. So I'd like the answer to those two questions. I know you can't, and nobody has been able to for a month. How long does it take to get an answer? Right. I thought she was in favor of all hostages being released. Well, this is an American hostage who has not been released. Chris Van Hollen recently issued a public statement about it. How come Chris Van Hollen can speak out, but my senator, who I have voted for in every election, cannot speak out? If she needs any information, she can look at Chris Van Hollen's statement. I don't think it's really a stretch to ask a country that we give billions of dollars to let go an American citizen, an American teenager. Okay, thank you. And I'll call again tomorrow in case I haven't heard. Thank you. Bye. Bye.
How often does that happen?
Does what happen?
You get a person.
Yeah, and then she says, next up, George Latimer.
Yeah.
How did Latimer go?
Well, the interesting thing about his office is that I do get somebody every single day. And with some minor variations, I leave the same message. But, Hastings in the Bronx, it's a small community. He has a small district. And that I have been calling every single day for a month and nobody can give me an answer. When I started this and I got a whole bunch of friends to participate, I naively thought, this is my representative. All right. Senators represent a whole state. This is my representative. And, just in case anybody does any fact checking and they say this isn't true, I'm making it all up, I have all of the logs on my phone with their names. Happy to share this.
I don't think anybody's going to doubt you, but good that you do.
Also, Ryan, this is, I know you know this, but this was Jamal Bowman's district.
Right.
And, he was buried under an avalanche of AIPAC money, which got George Latimer into power. And now, he obviously can't be bothered to help out an American kid. They also, when I got attacked in the West Bank, my mom was doing the same thing. If you can imagine the level of Jewish mother rage sort of dialed up after seeing her own child get attacked, and you still couldn't get an answer from anyone, right? Yeah. So
they said they'd call me back, and then they didn't.
And so, tell us a little bit about Mohammed Ibrahim. This is a boy that, as I understand it, is accused of possibly throwing a rock at some point.
Yeah. So
conditions. Yeah.
So he's 16. He was abducted when he was 15 in February. So basically, his family's from Florida. So they're American citizens. They have a home in Florida. He speaks fluent English. They also have a home in a town called Al Mazrah Al Sharqiya, which is outside of Ramallah in the West Bank. It's a community where there's lots of Palestinian Americans right by near where that settler attack happened that I filmed. This is also the same town where 20-year-old Saifullah Musalat was beaten to death in July. That's Mohammed's first cousin. Their moms are sisters. So anyway, in February, basically about 30 soldiers stormed into their family home at 3 a.m, went into his bedroom, zip tied him, blindfolded him, took him away. It didn't explain anything to his parents. So his parents had no idea where he was being taken, what he was being accused of. After a couple days, they were able to find out that basically he was being accused of throwing rocks, not of hurting anybody, but just of the act of throwing rocks. And basically Israel then said that he confessed to doing it. And Mohammed gave a sworn affidavit, which says basically he was beaten on the way to the police station after being abducted. He was beaten once he got there, and then they threatened to beat him again if he didn't confess. So, and obviously this is entirely consistent with lots of documentary evidence of what's happening in these prisons. And so it's been 9 months now, and he's lost between a third and a quarter of his body weight. He contracted scabies. He says he's been beaten repeatedly. He's not been allowed to speak to his parents once in 9 months. A teenager, a kid. And, to be clear, Israel's justification for this is that he's a security prisoner, which is the same term they would use for somebody, like a Hamas fighter who they captured on October 7th. So that's what we're talking about here. There's basically, there's been very little mainstream coverage of it. I mean, his name has not appeared in the New York Times in 9 months. And so I've been working with the family. I actually stayed with them for some time when I was out there in October to just make an all-out blitz on pressuring U.S. lawmakers to put pressure on the State Department and on the embassy over there. And what we know is that to the extent that anything's working, that's what's working. Because, I mean, I don't know, you might not have been able to tell, but these people are tired of hearing from my mom. This is a headache for them, and they want the headache to go away. And that is them,
let him go.
They deal with the headache by putting it on the embassy or the State Department, and eventually something's got to give, and they will hopefully just be all right, this is just too much trouble now, and let him go.
I did call the State Department also. They hung up on me.
And I'm with your mom. I have a 15-year-old right now, and it's just utterly unbearable, unthinkable to contemplate being zip tied and beaten and held in a cage.
And not to be able to see your child.
To not be able to speak with them.
Ryan, there was a moment a couple months ago or in the spring, actually, when he was being held in Megiddo prison, which is one of these well-known torture camps. And news broke that a 16-year-old kid from their area was beaten to death. And they didn't know if it was Mohammed. And basically they had 6 absolutely agonizing hours of trying to find out if it was him. They found out that it was a kid from the town next door, which obviously was still a tragedy, but like this is all the time. I mean, people are dropping dead in these prisons. There's constantly reports of people being starved and contracting diseases and sexual assault, and like they just have no way of knowing what's going on with him, which is just like it's disgraceful.
So Chris Van Hollen has spoken out about it. Who else, and who should
Yeah, so I mean, Chris Van Hollen has probably been the most vocal. Peter Welch, Merkley, like people you'd expect, Rashida Tlaib and others. I mean, my view, and I've been talking with the family about this, is like what needs to happen is there needs to be like a moment that like forces this into the spotlight and makes it a national issue. And so my idea was that there needs to be a demand that a delegation of U.S. lawmakers from both sides of the aisle go to Israel and demand to see him in prison. And if they are allowed to see him, great, we'll get an update. If they're not allowed to see him, then Israel has just refused U.S. lawmakers. So like we just started putting that ask out. Haven't heard back yet, but yeah, I mean, look, like there's a handful of U.S. lawmakers that have spoken out and with like real moral clarity, like Van Hollen. But I think it's safe to say that this is not being treated the way like the Israeli American hostages who were fighting in the IDF when they were in Gaza. The sort of urgency of freeing them, like there's nowhere near that level of urgency for Mohammed.
Is the hope that this shines a spotlight on the broader conditions? Because I imagine that, and I'm curious how the Palestinians that you've spoken to feel about this, because there's this idea that like if you have that blue passport, at least you have some hope.
Yeah,
Israelis actually feel the same way. Like Israelis were saying during the hostage negotiations, oh, our government only cares about Israeli citizens if they have a blue passport.
I mean, I can say that like there's a sort of urgency to get Mohammed out, and as soon as that happens, there like the campaign and like the sort of campaign apparatus that is already in place is going to extend to just like the situation of Palestinian children in prisons. In terms of like what Palestinians over there think, I mean, one of the reasons I went to the West Bank in October on this particular trip was to report on these American villages, because I had just been in Washington, D.C. with the families of Mohammed, with the family of Saifullah Musalet, who was beaten to death, the family of Tawfiq Abdel-Jabbar, who was shot by an Israeli soldier, shot dead in January, Rachel Corrie's parents, Aysenor Agi's sister and husband. So, a whole delegation of people were American citizens whose family members were killed by settlers and soldiers. And then that's when I started to learn about these American communities. And so I went out there to visit them. And basically, like, the situation is these places actually were kind of insulated from the occupation violence for a long time because they have money. Right. And it's just kind of like, they look much more like, they feel more like an American city than they do like what you would imagine of like olive farmers in the West Bank. But they are now being attacked regularly, and their children are being killed like they are everywhere in Palestine. And so it's not as if like the focus on these Americans is to say like Americans deserve better. The point is like, if even the Americans are now being killed and attacked, and the U.S. Embassy and the State Department can't be bothered to do anything to protect them, then what does that say about the situation of Palestine and U.S. relations with Israel?
So I love every child. They're Palestinian, they're American. I love those children. I am a Jewish mother and a Jewish grandmother. They are my children as much as the world's children. They should be the world's children. And for us to allow this to happen, I feel like I can have a limited effect because he's an American child, but my heart breaks for every one of these families separated from their children. For what? For what? How many of us didn't do a stupid thing when we were 15? You get a rap on the wrist and start again. But that my Congress people won't lift a finger when we give billions. I can't believe that after giving billions, if one of these people in a position of power Marco Rubio, Mike Huckabee, any one of these Congress people that's had dealings with Netanyahu, they said, we want this child released. I can't believe they wouldn't release that child.
Right.
And that breaks my heart.
No, I think that's right. And so we had 2 separate correspondents on the 2 most recent flotillas that went to Gaza. And I was regularly in touch with the embassy in Jerusalem, U.S. embassy in Jerusalem, looking into the conditions of them. And from what we got back, every other embassy in Israel was far more responsive, cared far more. It took a significant amount of time just to get a response. So to your point, there just seems to be very little.
There's a story yesterday that, just like another story that I hadn't heard of yet, of an American guy and his mother who went out there to do protective presence to the West Bank, and a bunch of them got arrested. And it was the same thing. All the Europeans, their embassy stepped in right away and got them released. The Americans were in prison for 5 days because the embassy wouldn't do anything to help them.
Yeah, Europeans had flights arranged, hotels, like the whole 9. Last question for your mom, because I think this on behalf of some of the audience watching. For people who want to do what you're doing but don't really know where to start, like, what have you learned about the process of pressuring your members of the Senate or the House, the calls, emails? Like, what works, what doesn't work? How do you keep the streak alive, to use kind of the Duolingo phrase?
Well, for one thing, I think, for most people, you don't want it to take up your whole day. So I have them on speed dial. So you go online, you get their Washington offices, and it's a 202 number, and you have them on speed dial. So that's fast. And then you try to strike up some kind of empathic relationship with the aide who's answering the phone. Like the woman I spoke to today and yesterday from Latimer's office, she knows me. She says, is it the same 2 questions, Sharon? And I said, yes, it's the same 2 questions. And then I add a level of frustration.
Do you have a script in front of you or notes or something?
I used to have a script. I have a script written out. I don't need to use it any longer. But it is surprisingly satisfying to speak to somebody and, to say, I've known Kirsten Gillibrand since she was pregnant with twins. I know Chuck Schumer, since before he had grandchildren. And, I've been Jewish longer than most of these people have been alive. And this is so intrinsic to my value system. So I don't know, I haven't had any success yet, so I'm not sure if there are other people who have had success. And naively, when I started this, I thought, oh, I'll get a response. Maybe it'll take a couple of weeks, but I'll get a response. And nothing.
You would think.
Right. Can I ask one question to my mom, actually? Somebody tweeted in response to the video, someone should call her back and explain her son is a self-hating capo, and instead of calling senators, she should invest in therapy for the little capo spawn. So I wanted to just, give her a chance to respond to that, to me being a self-hating, explaining to you that I'm a self-hating capo.
Well, as I said before, I am a proud Jewish mother. And as a proud Jewish mother, I have certain values. And to me, I have nothing but respect for my son, who I believe is the living embodiment of those values. And you see it when you see the videos of him in the fields with the olive farmers, and you see the affection that they have for him. This is not a self-hating capo. This is a proud Jewish man with Jewish values that hopefully were instilled from his father and me from when he was a child. And,
my mom's family was exterminated in the Holocaust, like entire branches of the family tree,
my mother's
incinerated.
Entire family.
And my dad's family was from the Middle East, and they also faced deadly anti-Semitism. So people are just constantly attacking me online, from the right Zionist side, obviously, and saying like, do you have any connection to being Jewish even? You're a Jew in name only, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I don't know how much more Jewish like we could possibly be. I mean, it's just.
I'd like somebody to explain to me how what the settlers are doing is different from the pogroms that my father's family endured. I'd like them to explain that to me, because I don't see a difference. And I learned all about the pogroms from my family.
Well, I think any mother should be proud of what your son is up to. He's doing good, and you should definitely be proud. And we're all grateful for what you're doing too. So,
and I'm proud of my mom.
We all are.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much.
Bye.
Well, that'll do it for us here on the Tuesday morning Drop Site live stream. As always, if you can support our work, you can go to donate.dropsitenews.com, or you can upgrade to a paid subscription. It's donations and subscriptions that fuel this work. Again, on behalf of all of my colleagues here at Drop Site News, thank you, and have a as delightful a Thanksgiving as you possibly can.